My guest today is Shirley Wang. She's the director of marketing at Pod People, a creative production studio which has produced and amplified podcasts for the likes of Vogue, People Magazine, Netflix, and Marvel, just to name a few. She's also a public speaker and has recently shared her expertise on stage at Podcast Movement in Las Vegas. I feel grateful that I was able to pick her brain, and I'm super excited to share these insights with you. In this episode, we talk about which podcast metrics she pays most attention to, what data sources she uses, and how her data wrangling process looks like, how to choose social media creators to promote your show, including industry benchmarks for engagement, what mistakes to avoid when interpreting data, and general misconceptions around podcast analytics, and how app features influence your downloads over time. Enjoy. Hi, Shirley. Thank you so much for coming on the
Hello.
show.
Thank you. Yeah, so excited to be here to talk about podcasts and analytics.
Yeah, so I was about to say you and I share a passion for podcast analytics, and I think today's episode is going to be a treat for all of you podcast analytics nerds out there, but also, more generally speaking, for people who are interested in improving the knowledge of podcast analytics.
Yeah, let's get started.
What are the podcast metrics you pay most attention to?
I think that there's a lot of really important metrics out there. Sometimes I know it's really hard to identify which ones are the most important, though. I think that for me and Pod People personally, we like to split it into two different buckets. So that's building awareness and discoverability. And the second bucket is monitoring and increasing engagement. And so on the brand building side, it's things like your downloads, it's things like your unique listeners, how many people are tuning into your show that are new versus your existing listeners. And then things like tracking your chart rankings even is really important, because chart rankings and things like editorial submissions can be a part of growing your show as well. And then on the engagement side, it's things like your consumption rate. How much are your listeners actually engaging and listening to your show? That's a really good way to find out if maybe your 1 hour episode could actually just be 20 minutes instead. Things like your engaged listeners and even your followers, how many people are actually following your show on any given season is also really important. And just making sure that when you're tracking against these metrics, you want to track it against both industry benchmarks, but you're also wanting to track it against your own show from a season to season basis. So you always want to see some long-term growth, and just growth between seasons is a really good indicator, because I think a lot of times clients might get a little just sad about if their show's not reaching 50,000 downloads a month. But a lot of times it's about expectation setting too, and being well, you have a really niche show within a very niche industry, maybe like UI or something. What you can expect is actually closer to this. And so that's when it becomes more important to see that from season 1 to season 2, you've had X percentage amount of growth on all of these metrics. And that's really what's more important, is comparing your growth across your own show rather than trying to compare it to a Call Your Daddy or something like that. It's just totally different realms of categories and longevity and the type of content and genre. So those are some of the few metrics that we'll look at, but we always like to look at the comprehensive overview of all of the data as well. But those are some of the ones we focus on.
Yeah, it's important to always keep your total addressable market in mind, and that varies depending on the genre and even the topics genre by genre, so it can be very different from show to show.
Yeah, exactly.
What about social media? Are there specific metrics that you pay attention to, ones that you completely disregard because you think they're vanity metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for social media, we view it as very complementary stack of analytics that we can use to plug into the general podcasting platforms, because it's probably no secret, but just a lot of our podcasting platforms and analytics systems are a little bit less advanced, generally speaking, in terms of providing a super comprehensive way of tracking those metrics. So social media is really great, especially if you're making something like a video podcast. YouTube has a super comprehensive suite of analytics, even things like your Instagram, your TikTok, anything that can really help to better understand and paint a picture of who your listener is, begin understanding what are their habits, where do they spend the most time. a lot of advertisers do really value that specific demographic information from age to household income. It makes it easier for you to run any targeted paid ads as well. And so for social media metrics specifically, we do also like to focus on engagement. And I almost view this as, depending on what your goals are again. So if you're trying to, for example, find a host, you're at the very beginning of your podcast, it's extremely important not just to look at things like what their follower count is, but also to look at what is the, percentage of their followers that are actually engaging with their posts on, not just any given post, but overall. And there are really awesome tools that are free out there. Tools like Grin, that's an influencer management platform tool. You basically, it's almost like the color picker plugin on Chrome, where you just kind of turn on the Grin app. It's more of a plugin, the Grin plugin. And then you can go to any of your favorite, creators or hosts or whoever's social media. You can go to your mom's social media account and do this too. And you can see firsthand, not just the amount of followers, but how did their last post do? What percentage of engagement? Something that's really important to know is a lot of times just because someone has 1 million followers doesn't mean that their engagement is automatically high. It could be less than 1%. And a lot of times we found that the sweet spot is people with followers from 10,000 to 50,000. They have super high engagement rates, whereas the average is maybe 3% on, let's just say, Instagram. They might be having engagement upwards of 20%, which means that they're better able to convert their followers, those loyal listeners, or those loyal followers, into more engaged listeners for the show. And so that's something that we like to analyze at the very beginning of even talking about these concepts to our clients is, okay, it's really great. We really need to definitely nail down the content side, but we also need to be mindful of who we're actually choosing to be, not just the host, but potentially the guests that we invite, things like that. And so that's just one example of using social media metrics that are more readily available. It's a lot easier to do benchmarking for socials because it's all publicly available data. You can see how many followers people have, whereas for podcasting, you can't really see how many people follow or subscribe to a podcast. And so that's also really helpful for benchmarking upfront and doing that analysis so that you can understand the competitive landscape.
Awesome. And just for our audience, everything you mentioned about that Grin plugin, it's for when you're doing influencer discovery to find influencers or social media influencers to promote one of your shows or one of your client shows, right?
Yeah, and that's just a tool that, we like to use. There's plenty of tools that do exactly the same thing. I just find that Grin was kind of, one of the places where when I was looking up the difference between a nano influencer to a micro influencer to, a huge million plus influencer, what are the benchmarks we can expect across the different platforms? So that being Instagram, that being TikTok, that being LinkedIn and YouTube, given how many followers that each of those different categories of influencers and creators, I should really say it's really a creator, but just seeing okay, right now TikTok has extremely high organic growth. So that average is probably going to be more 18% versus Instagram and Facebook has reached that peak. It's been a much more mature platform for a while now. It's closer to 3.5% for Instagram for that same influencer with the same number of followers. And so that's just one example of a platform. There's many other tools I'm sure that you can use for that particular purpose to understand engagement. I found that to be the easiest to use. It's free, and you can also just go in and see other really cool aspects of it as well. They also have an engagement. They just have really great explanations of how to even calculate engagement. So things like that I found to be helpful. And so, yeah, that's just one example of the tool.
Okay, so your benchmark for TikTok, 18%, for Instagram, 3%. I think it's also important to mention that some of the social media influencers or creators buy followers. Some of these followers are bots as well. So it's really important to look at that engagement metric.
Yeah, that's totally true. Yeah. I think that's a great call out. I think that a lot of times we've really been surprised to see that some of the talent lists that we've been given by our clients to explore and see if they're available even as hosts. We've been really surprised to see that a lot of times, their engagement is often not as high as we might have wanted. we've even done experiments across our own shows where we had a series of 4 original shows and for Pod People, and our creators that we chose to lead those shows each had different rates of engagement. And we saw a direct correlation even between the creators who had a extremely niche, extremely engaged following, upwards of 20% plus, directly translated to way more downloads than some of our creators who had more around that 2% engagement rate. And it was fascinating to just have that comparison. At the time, we didn't even methodically go about choosing influencers based off of those engagement rates. But that's something that we learned after the fact, where we were able to see that data. We're able to do that, grin tool and see what their engagement rate actually was across their social platforms. We had 6+ months worth of data, and we're like, whoa, like that is a crazy correlation just to see 1-to-1 engagement rates on their social platforms versus their downloads per show. So it was crazy to see that. And that was in retrospect, but now going forward, we know that that's something that's super important.
Super powerful insight.
Mm-hmm.
What's your biggest pain point when it comes to podcast analytics?
I think it's the fact that, a lot of people face the same issue of just not having a lot of the analytics to inform their decision-making and inform their strategy. Another common one is the fact that these audio platforms don't have a built-in discovery engine, so that a lot of times, like what we found directly from our clients is that they're attracted to podcasting because they don't have to be on camera. They don't have to be like camera ready, face full of makeup, hair done, stuff like that. But then, that's really fine if you're just focused only on creating a high quality podcast based off of just the content. But then you have me, the marketer, come in and I'm like, whoa, like you actually do have to do a video podcast of some sort, even just short form video content, if you want to get any semblance of, discovery out there, because it's easy enough to do an audiogram where you're just taking highlights of a clip and inserting it into a static kind of, animated post. But as we all know, like people are attracted to the human, they're attracted to the host and the guest. They don't want to see a static visual with a wave, flickering around. That's not what's going to get people to stop and actually listen and engage on social media. So then a lot of times we have to back up a little bit and be like, well, at the very least, we need some form of short form content. And then that completely changes because it suddenly becomes a hybrid of audio and some level of video. And so I think that the discoverability engine part of it is really hard. When I first started out, would look to how other marketers would go about even just getting email subscribers to their newsletters, because it's the same kind of issue where it's not like newsletters necessarily have a built-in engine. You have to find your, people who really understand your message and really want to listen or read whatever it is about what you're putting out into the world. You have to give genuine value. And I would look to those, different channels that wouldn't have that built-in discoverability and think about, okay, how did these other marketers go about getting people to actually, give them their emails so that they would actually read their email newsletters every Monday. And that helped a lot in terms of thinking about how we could then translate that into a podcast strategy. So yeah, that's been a little bit tough. I think that compared to some other, marketing tools that I've used, there's just not quite as much data as I would have liked, even just in terms of reporting and collecting that data and then aggregating it into an overall comprehensive summary, for example, of 6 months worth of data. I had to just basically go in, pull that Excel sheet, create formulas essentially that would generate the, whatever outcome it was that I wanted to. And so it's not as advanced. That being said, our team hadn't necessarily explored things like Tableau. We hadn't explored more advanced data visualization tools to plug in. And truthfully, I don't know if that's something that even integrates as well. But I think that as long as I'm someone who really emphasizes tracking every single campaign or whatever it is that we do, there is still just a lot of tactics that work in podcast marketing that you can't track. Even things like the editorial submissions, which I know for PR type related activities, it is a lot harder, but it's really hard to say directly this editorial submission contributed to this growth in the podcast, without just kind of having to really try to isolate that factor from any other marketing tactic, and just kind of being willing to say, like, yeah, it seems like this contributed to that growth. But it's just been a little hard because I am so used to just tracking everything I do so that I can continue to iterate and improve from there.
You get this data from many different platforms. You mentioned using Excel, I think. But so generally speaking, how does your data cleaning and wrangling look like? How does this process look like for you?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We use a variety of different tools and platforms to help us understand our data. We use Megaphone as our main platform for hosting, and that gives us, a set of data that we use. We use Apple Spotify data, and from Apple specifically, things like consumption rate is really important to us to understand on an episode by episode basis, but also aggregating that, how engaged people actually are in listening to the podcast. We also use, Spotify for the demographic aspects of it, because Apple and Megaphone doesn't really provide that information. But yeah, we look at the charts, we look at a lot of different variables. And when we do run into the issue of, hey, we don't have enough of this information, that's where we do tend to pull in the social media platforms to help supplement it. And of course, it's not a one-to-one comparison. We've actually tracked podcast downloads very differently from how we track YouTube listens, because that's just it starts becoming more video and less audio platform and obviously, so we do kind of track that a little differently as well. But all of that information is still really helpful to paint a more holistic picture. And we've even had some clients do things like surveys to understand their audience better, pixels, things like that. So we do really value that data that we can get, and we try to basically squeeze it out from wherever we can, because that's the only way that we can actually understand what we're doing well, what we're not, tracking that, and then doubling down on things that are working.
Got it. Yeah, so you don't necessarily have like one source of truth, but it's more, let's say, composite picture of different dashboards that you use that gives you different information. It probably takes a lot of time to bring all that information together, I guess.
Yeah, it does. One other thing I forgot to mention as well is that I am definitely someone who tries to keep on top of all the benchmarking reports that come out from places like Buzzsprout, things like that. So that also tends to help us. At this point, we've also worked with probably 100 plus shows at this point. So I think that having that level of aggregate data across different networks, across different individual shows, clients in different industries, also helps us to paint a more holistic view of what is a realistic benchmark that we can be setting for season 1, for season 2, for the types of shows that we're producing. We do everything from docu-style to your normal interview chat show to fiction. So each of those play a little bit of a different factor as well. And so, for fiction, for example, we did this show called The Royals recently that's had a lot of success, and we attribute a lot of that to selecting an influencer who is extremely passionate about the project and also just really excited to be posting about her show. She's also someone with millions of followers across her platforms, but specifically TikTok and Instagram, and her engagement levels are off the charts. And so things like that really matter. We also had a show recently with a different client within a food and wine magazine that has also done really well, and that was docu-style. And a lot of that was a completely different strategy. Obviously, we couldn't just pull an influencer and put, that person in the host seat. It was docu-style, so it was very much more investigative. We had a reporter doing it, so we couldn't just rely on the reporter's network of social media fans. It was more reliance on multiple different other aspects, and we were lucky in that they were extremely easy and willing to work with us, and they had really awesome built out existing marketing channels that we fully utilize to get the word out about that. So each strategy is a little bit different, but yeah, it's crazy to see how different they are and how you have to tweak your strategy a little bit for each one. But a lot of the fundamentals are still there. And I think that it always just comes down to really taking the knowledge that we do know from those platforms and from the data and really using that to inform our future strategies.
Got it. And you mentioned you're not using a particular visualization solution such as Looker, Tableau. You're getting the reports directly from where you can find them, so like YouTube, Spotify, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Typically speaking, it's been something that we kind of looked into, but again, like data set itself is not so much data that we need something that advanced. And so we've typically found it easier just not go into the whole process of setting something like that up because we just don't have the amount of data necessarily that would be helpful with something like that. I'm sure it would have been really helpful, but again, that just comes from kind of the lack of data that we do get, I guess, from the platforms themselves.
Got it. And short, shameless plug here, but the pain point that you just mentioned, having to juggle with so many data sources is something that we're solving with Voxelize, with our analytics solution, where we're trying to get as many data points as possible into the interface so that podcast publishers don't have to log in into so many platforms to get their data and make their work easier.
Awesome. Yeah, we're excited to check that out whenever we've already been poking around a lot in the SEO function. So love to hear that it's expanding.
What's a mistake that you often see podcast marketers make when it comes to podcast data?
Sometimes it's just the simple things like, did we even set it up for capturing that data in the first place? Sometimes that doesn't necessarily happen. I found that like even just making sure that things like the prefix are set up so that we're able to capture that historical data. We've run into that a lot with our clients where, they're not in the podcasting space. They're not industry experts. So it's a very common and understandable problem for, why it is. But a lot of times we'll have clients with existing shows come to us they want us to help promote their show because they've noticed that their show is stagnating. And so a lot of times we'll go in and we'll be super excited to review their analytics and then realize that there's just nothing there to track from, the last 3 seasons. So sometimes it's just a matter of getting those platforms set up in the first place, and just doing the best we can there to start understanding it from then on. But a lot of times it helps tremendously if the clients already do have that existing seasonal data. But we found that, not 8 times out of 10, and it's not their faults that they don't know what all the podcasting, platforms and analytics tools are. But we do kind of go in, we're like, oh, shoot, we don't have like the things that we would have loved to analyze. So it becomes more of like a experimental season where we see what's working. And it's always experimental, but where we're just like truly kind of guessing and trying to understand potentially where their pain points were coming from, and then utilizing that information from that season to then improve for future seasons.
Interesting. Okay, so the biggest mistake is like not having your podcast data infrastructure in place, not having maybe created your account with Spotify for podcasters or the Apple Podcast version of that. What's a common way people might misread podcast data, let's say, and take the wrong decision based off of that?
I mean, I think sometimes it's just, the easiest one is kind of similar to the social media question we had earlier, but just focusing more on vanity metrics than the true engagement metrics. Downloads are really great, but we've run into so many times where we've seen that, you can just very easily buy downloads even if you truly wanted to. And whether it's through bots, whether it's through just a paid ad. And at the end of the day, like, that's fine if your goal is to get more downloads, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your audience is resonating with your content or that they're following you on a week by week basis. So I think that a lot of times there's too much of a focus on downloads and not enough of a focus on a lot of the other things that point to whether or not people are actually enjoying your show, whether there's a community of listeners being built around it, whether there's just actual traction for your show. And so that's something that we always have to remind our clients is that, downloads are really great, but they're not the only source of truth. Even things like data on, your website and seeing how many people came to your website after listening to your show. For some of our clients, they're more focused on lead generation, for example. So even things like that might be a better indicator of how successful your show was in driving those loyal listeners into then loyal paying customers potentially. So I think that downloads are a really great beginner metric for helping to understand how well your show's doing. But given that they are so easy to manipulate at this point in time, it's also a very arbitrary metric. Same as followers. You can always buy followers. You can always buy downloads, but you can't buy engagement necessarily. Yeah, like maybe you can have a bot that just continues to like comment, but like that's not true engagement, and they often get reported for that anyway. So
Yeah, it's much easier to fake. I know Pod People's clients regularly get featured by listening apps, listening platforms. What impact do you see there in terms of number of downloads? I know you just mentioned downloads can be misleading, but I guess that's still a metric we need to look at, especially when it comes to features. What impact do you see there for shows that just started versus shows that are maybe 1-2 seasons in?
yeah, we actually have a great example of this because we had a client who didn't do any marketing whatsoever for their show for about 2 seasons, and they didn't have a budget for doing that either. And it was a really great opportunity to isolate an editorial feature as the variable and see what it did for the next season and also the end of that season. And so the submission came at the end of season 2. And so we were able to directly see impacts for the end of that season and then the beginning of the season of the next season that basically it continued right after season 2. So not really a break in between necessarily. We were able to see that the number of downloads grew by 3 times the amount of the original average amount of downloads. All of that is you have to put context behind it though still too, because, an editorial submission for a show that maybe only has on average 2,000 downloads an episode is going to have a significantly greater impact. And so when I say 3 times, that's going from, 2,000 to 6,000 downloads for the next month, maybe for the next like 3 episodes. But we did see that, once that feature was removed, it didn't necessarily mean that it kept at that 6,000 downloads an episode status. It did go down, though it was more of a slow descent. It was interesting, though, to see that, like the feature got that particular podcast more downloads as a whole for the next month, essentially. And that was really cool to see. I remember that when I was first learning more about the space, I remember Dan Meisner actually said something really interesting that was basically like, and Dan Meisner is the founder of Bumper, but he said something that was like, a lot of your podcast marketing is just to get people aware of your show. But then whether or not they stick around, whether or not they listen is entirely dependent on the show concept and the content itself. So I find that to be really interesting because I think that a lot of that is true. Like you can't market a show that's just not, I mean, you can, but like it's just not going to be as effective if it's not a super compelling and interesting show. And so I think I credit some of that also to just the show itself was a really fascinating and a unique angle on, it was a history podcast. And I just think that it drew people's attention more. And who's to say that if you had a show that was featured that, maybe just wasn't as interesting to click on, like, I don't know if you'd get the same results necessarily. And we were lucky in that we were just able to isolate that feature entirely from other marketing strategies that we started after the feature so that we were able to see that. But a lot of times it is kind of hard to actually evaluate how much of an impact it has because for a lot of our clients, we're, launching the show and we're doing the submissions and they get featured. We're also doing like 10 other things for their show. So it's hard to say exactly like what led to that growth. But for this particular client, for this particular instance, we did see a significant growth.
It's really ideal for attribution if you can like run these promotions one by one and you can just isolate, you have your baseline and you can see the impact. You mentioned that the downloads went down slowly, but not immediately after the feature was stopped. How much would you say is due to maybe new followers? Like when people follow on Apple, the episodes get automatically downloaded to their device. How much of that caused this is stable, higher number of downloads?
I think it could have just been that, when when a show gets featured, people just automatically click on whatever the latest episode is. And then it's kind of a downstream effect of how long people are willing to stay past that initial episode. So, I mean, I think most people probably stayed for 1 to 2 episodes before they potentially, attention spans are short these days, just started trailing away. And so I think that was kind of why it started to trail a little bit was because like listening to more than, personally speaking, I probably, depending on the episode length, I guess, if it's 20 minutes versus an hour, it's a completely different story. But a lot of it for me is just dependent on like what I'm doing at the time and if I get distracted even. So I think, 2 to even 3 episodes is a good amount of time, I think, for an audience a listener to stay listening. And so I think it was just kind of a natural dive in just downstream like decreasing effect because, like I think it's really hard these days to get people to listen to like 10 plus episodes. So I think some of it was just naturally kind of fell into place like that.
Got it. Do you remember how long it took to get from 6,000 downloads to 5,000 downloads an episode?
I think the next episode.
The podcast was being released like on a weekly base or monthly base?
Weekly, yeah. Yeah, I think people just, the feature's really great, but people just forget about your show again. Like you have to constantly remind them that it's there. So even, week difference that like, a lot can happen in a week and people might just forget. Unless they follow your show, they might just forget about your show. So that's why it's so hard. And that's why the premise of the show and the content is so important, because you want it to be extremely sticky and extremely relevant, extremely niche, so that that person who's following your podcast is like, I definitively only want to go to this show for this topic.
Got it. I want to come back to something you said about using a newsletter to promote your podcast, but it's also the reverse, where you use your podcast to promote a newsletter to then promote your podcast, if that makes sense, like to kind of like get a loyal audience that you can just, send out an email out to and say, hey, the new episode just dropped. Do you have best practices there or good examples of podcasts that have managed to convert their listenership into email subscribers, maybe with lead magnets, things like that?
Wow, I feel like this question could lead into a whole nother episode. Truthfully, I think that email and newsletters are such a fascinating area as well that can be underutilized as well within the space. But I think that email newsletters are one of the most like underrated marketing channels right now. And I think that the people who it's very similar to podcasting, that if you're following that podcast, if you're following that person for their newsletter, you're pretty engaged at that point. If you're willing to like have them be in your inbox on a weekly or daily or whatever it is basis, you have to have seen a lot of their other content already, most likely, maybe their website, maybe their social media channels, maybe their YouTube, whatever, and been like, wow, this person gives me so much information about this topic that I really want to consistently learn about it. And so I think that the type of people who exist on TikTok, for example, a lot of it's, entertainment based. A lot of it is fleeting. It's short attention spans. Those followers are not necessarily as loyal as the ones who receive your newsletter every single week and like really click through and and read through all of the things that you're sending out. And so, yeah, it's obviously a really great another channel to explore for your podcast. Again, it's very similar though in terms of podcasts, and that a lot of it is more retention focused. And so when thinking about your marketing strategy, I think that it's important to think through all parts of the funnel and think through like, oh, like what am I lacking in terms of how I can get more people aware of this podcast? And a lot of times what's lacking is those awareness channels at the top of the funnel. And so I think that it's still a really great way to get your podcast in front of those people, especially if it comes from a really trusted source newsletter. I think a lot of times too, in terms of a paid media budget, those newsletters are oftentimes a lot more reasonable speaking than like, trying to advertise on a how I built this, for example. And so they can be a really great way for your clients to still reach a really great audience pool that fits their particular target audience profile, but pay a lot less. And there's so many newsletters out there, honestly, that even if they only have 1,000, subscribers to their newsletter, but they're exactly the topic that your listeners are focused on, that could be potentially a way better strategy than a lot of other things. And so, yeah, I think it's a really great area that people should 100% explore. And whether it's paid, whether it's a free mention, whatever it is, like, I think that it's something that gets overlooked at times. And the reason is it's just because it can take a lot of time to build those relationships with those people who run the newsletters, and it can take money. It can take, it's just oftentimes not as easy as just, some other things. And I think that's always a fine balance too, is that there's so many things you can do within marketing and you only have so much time at the end of the day, and you need to optimize that. So a lot of it is figuring out where you should be optimizing your time. And again, roundabout answer, the way to figure that out is through your data. So that's why season 1, I think, is such a great experimental training ground for doing as much as you can across different marketing channels, across different parts of the funnel, and then tracking all of that, seeing what's working. And then for season 2 and beyond, you can really be like, wow, this worked really well, or this didn't work at all. Like, let's continue down that path, or let's eliminate that. That's something that we're always doing at Pod People as well. And so I think that that's, a really great way to understand where to best effectively spend your time. And just as an example, we realized that, cross promotions, for example, even though a lot of people in the industry talk about how effective it is, we found that conversion rates relative to the amount of time that we spend on those cross promotions is not worth that return on time and energy and, communication sent. And we still do them occasionally, but there are many other things, I think, within the marketing stack that are a lot more effective. But sometimes it just takes more time, or sometimes it takes more money. So it's all just kind of a trade-off, honestly, at the end of the day.
My last question to you, I know Pod People has a certain methodology when it comes to brand building and increasing engagement. Can you tell listeners more about this?
Yeah, I kind of touched upon it earlier in the episode, I guess, but because podcasting is such a retention-based channel, we do, again, split it into that brand building aspect. And then, so everything from brand awareness, things like downloads, to increasing engagement for the long term and tracking that. It's almost like your launch strategy is one thing. It's all about making a big splash. You basically want to be everywhere. But then in terms of your actual long-term audience growth strategy, that's a completely different area of marketing that takes a lot more effort. It's way easier to plan a 1 week, like even 2 weeks maybe, to plan for a launch. Like, you get all your assets ready, you get all your PR submissions, whatever, ready. But then where a lot of people lose steam is that long-term audience development of continuing to do things to promote your show, continuing to innovate, continuing to study what's doing well, what's doing not. That's where a lot of times it's just time and it's effort and it's a lot of hard work. And I 100% understand why it's not easy to always spend that amount of time, but it's a continuous process. The most successful people are always consistent in what they do. I think that the influencers, for example, that make it, they're all extremely consistent posters. They're the ones getting content out every day or every week or every 3 times a week. And for a lot of people, it's really hard. And for clients, especially, like, they're juggling 1,000 other things. Like, they can't do that full time. And that's totally understandable. But that's kind of where Pod People comes in, and we really try to help them to really help with the full marketing stack and provide them the assets or provide them the support needed to get them to that place where they can consistently promote it on an ongoing basis. So everything is just a trade-off at the end of the day. And so it's about like what you're prioritizing within your marketing strategy and how much time it might take. So
Got it. So to sum it up, for the launch, make a big splash. Then season 1 is for experimentation, and then season 2 and beyond is for scaling what works.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the fun part comes in. It's not new, it's not splashy anymore, but what can you do in spite of that to continue to promote this great show that you've developed and created? And even if it's something as big as changing your concept, because you're noticing that your Instagram polls, you're like, oh, like our listeners are not resonating as much with this topic as they thought. So there's a lot of fun that goes in both on the content and the marketing side. And I would say don't be afraid to really make sure that it's first and foremost giving value to your listener and to your audience. I think that's the most important thing for marketing, is to always, for anything really, whether it's your company, your product, whatever, it's always putting whoever the end person is, end user, the listener first, and really just trying to get into their shoes and thinking, how can I give the most amount of value to this person at the end of the day and want them to come back. And a lot of times I found it's a two-way street. The more you give, the more they're willing to come back. And it's okay if you're giving away, what you think is your proprietary information, because only you at the end of the day can do what you do. So it's really cool to see that, it really is about giving the most amount of value.
Where can our listeners find you and follow you?
Podpeople.com is a great first step, but we also have social media channels across Instagram and LinkedIn and our YouTube channel. So I would say podpeople.com will get you to all of those places. And for me personally, just Shirley Wang across all the platforms. And yeah, I would always love to connect with anyone. I love, in case you couldn't tell, I love nerding out on marketing strategy. I think it's the most fascinating thing. And there's so many innovations, especially in this space. So you just really always have to adapt and keep on top of the trends. So yeah, just really excited to connect with anyone that wants to talk more. And this has been a lovely chat as well. So thank you for allowing me to fully nerd out on all things marketing and data and audience growth. So thank you.